So welcome again to this relief video, and it's a wonderful child program of Dr. Rajiv Raman, a very dynamic person and arthroscopic surgeon everybody knows from Kolkata. And he started this video session, and it's really doing wonders by showing a small video to all this. I have with me Dr. Ravi Bhardwaj, who will be coordinating the whole show, and with me prominent and eminent faculty Dr. Anil Bhatt, Dr. Abhijit Wagaonkar, Dr. Ravi Bhardwaj, and I'll be having a small video. So I welcome you all in this forum, and welcome to all the delegates, and welcome Dr. Ashok Shyam and Neeraj Bijlani from Ortho TV for organizing this forum. I'll hand over to Dr. Rajiv Raman to take it further. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anup Agarwal, our series convener. And it was a brainchild of Ashok only. He told me we should start this session. And I told, all right, let's start with some specific joint. And first session was very successful, foot and ankle. The second session, I would like to thank especially Dr. Ravi Ganesh Bhardwaj, consultant orthopedics and hand and wrist surgeon in Apollo Hospital, Kolkata, for coordinating this session. So over to Ravi, Dr. Ravi Ganesh Bhardwaj, the series coordinator for hand and wrist Relight surgical video series.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. A very warm welcome to all of you. So this is going to be slightly different because instead of didactic lectures, which we are all sort of getting a little bit tired about, I think we are going to have short real-life videos demonstrating the salient steps. So we'll run through 4 videos, and then we will take questions at the end all together. So the way it's going to run is we're going to start from proximal, from the wrist, and work our way towards the finger joints. So I would first like to invite my very dear friend, Dr. Abhijit Wagaonkar from Pune. He needs no introduction. All of us in the hand fraternity know him very well. So he's going to talk about dorsal approach to distal radius. All of us are familiar with the volar approach, and we are very commonly operating on most of our fractures, but the dorsal approach is slightly different, and I thought it might be interesting and of interest to many of our colleagues, and that's why the choice of this topic. So after that, we will have Professor Anil Bhatt, and then Dr. Anup Agarwal, and lastly, I will be talking on PIP joint fracture dislocation. Over to you, Abhijit.
Thank you.
All yours.
Thank you very much, and Rajiv Da, Dr. Agarwal, sir. Anil, Ravi, and the Ortho TV team, thank you very much for this opportunity. And as Ravi rightly said, most of us are well versed with volar approach to the radius. Dorsal approach is something that we tend to shy away from. I'm sure there must be more and more people who are doing it today. However, this subject or this approach does merit attention and readdressing for that matter. And I'm going to try and make this as short and sweet without much of didactic jargon, and focus on the technique and the steps for this particular approach. So I don't have any conflict of interest. My only disclosure is that most of what I'm going to talk about, I have learned from my teacher, Professor Anil Bhatt, and I would like to acknowledge him for all that he has done. So the principles of surgical treatment for any fracture involve certain goals, and these are, which I'm sure all of you would concede, would be articular reduction, either through a percutaneous or an arthroscopic or an open approach, especially when intra-articular fractures or extension of diaphyseal, metaphyseal fractures into the articular surfaces are concerned. When it is distal radius, we talk about restoration of all parameters of the distal radius, such as the radial length, the volar tilt, and the radial inclination. And as for any fracture, one of the most important goals of treatment is to accomplish or achieve a stable reduction and a fixation, and then to allow early range of movement so as to optimize the outcomes of treatment of that particular fracture. This was a paper that was published by Dave Rouge, and they came up with what the optimal distal radius fracture alignment would look like and an articular step off of less than 2 millimeters, a radial shortening of less than 2 or 3 millimeters with a neutral tilt, and anything which is less than 5 degrees of loss of radial inclination would qualify to be an optimal distal radius fracture alignment. And if you can do better than this, obviously that would be desirable. Also, we talk about the AAOS clinical practice guideline recommendations, and they also have similar figures, except that the dorsal tilt is perhaps a little bit more as that published by David Rouge. But these are more or less the goals of treatment which we should aim for when we set out on the treatment of distal radius fractures. And suffice it to say that this is not only for open reduction, but it may be closed reduction and percutaneous spinning, or it may be arthroscopy assisted reduction and fixation. These are the common goals of treatment. Now, when we talk about surgical treatment of distal radius fractures, it is a surgeon who is responsible to obtain the reduction and not the implant, not the plate. So the surgeon accomplishes or achieves the reduction. The implant helps maintain the reduction, and usually we use volar plating when the volar cortex is comminuted or fractured and the dorsal is intact, and vice versa. We use the dorsal approach when the volar cortex is intact and there is dorsal comminution. And with whatever approach, whatever fracture that you're addressing, you should be prepared to use additional incisions as and when required. Use dorsal, volar, or radial fixation, or the so-called fragment-specific or hybrid fixation. You must have a back table ready with external fixators, K-wires, and you should also be ready to harvest bone graft if and when required. And all of this is towards a common goal of optimizing the outcomes for patients with distal radius fractures. Now, who are the ideal candidates for a dorsal approach for a distal radius fracture? These are usually patients who have a multi-fragmented and a dorsally displaced fracture of the distal radius. Those who have dorsal bony defects due to high velocity injury, or patients who have associated osteoporosis. And then keep in mind, we are talking about the fact that the volar cortex is intact. Here is a case in point. The X-rays may not look all that remarkable, but when you look at the CT scan, you will appreciate that, especially in the axial view, that the volar cortex is completely intact. There is a large dorsal ulnar fragment. There is a large dorsal central fragment, and also comminuted radial styloid fragment. And then if you look at the sagittal views, you will appreciate that there is a dorsal subluxation of the carpus. So this would be one of those ideal indications for a dorsal approach and fixation using plates. Now, these are cases where obviously K-wire fixation is out of question, and non-operative treatment again is not indicated. So this qualifies for surgery basically. So again, the indications are unstable fractures, post-closed reduction and splinting with unsuccessful reduction or loss of reduction, extra-articular fractures, intra-articular shear fractures, the AO type B, and the AO type C fractures. Contraindications, well, the only absolute contraindication would be volar comminution or a large volarly displaced fragment, especially with minimal dorsal defects. However, keep in mind or bear in mind that there are cases where you may need a sandwich fixation, that is to say a volar as well as a dorsal combined approach. And these are the cases where you would perhaps think of using a combined approach. However, that is outside the purview of today's talk, so we'll skip that. Relative contraindications, as with any other fractures or approaches, if there is skin compromise, soft tissue compromise, and so on and so forth, or if there is any comorbid condition that precludes surgery. And what is especially most important, we tend to underscore, is surgeon training and experience and the availability of correct implants. To my mind, I believe that this is perhaps the most important contraindication, and this is for the surgeon to know for himself whether he is comfortable using a dorsal approach, if he is having the correct implants and the adequate training and experience when you embark on addressing a distal radius fracture via a dorsal approach. There are some caveats when you would think of using a dorsal approach. It is often better to wait for around a week after injury to treat these fractures if there is no neurological or vascular compromise. And what does this do? This allows for better visualization of the fracture fragments. It allows for stabilization of any associated health situations such as diabetes, hypertension, and so on and so forth. And more importantly, it allows for reduction in the edema, which will allow for better wound healing and preclude wound healing complications. And at the same time, it gives you time to discuss with the patient and the family about the procedure and the outcomes. So sometimes a couple or three counseling sessions may be required to help the patient understand the outcomes and what would be required. The technique is standard. We use a dorsal midline longitudinal incision centered over the Lister's tubercle, minded that the Lister's tubercle is often fractured and comminuted, so it is in line with the third ray. The extensor pollicis longus is identified distal to the third dorsal compartment. And again, bear in mind that in a lot of fractures, the third compartment may be compromised. After you have identified the extensor pollicis longus and have de-roofed it, you evacuate the hematoma, you elevate the, this should be a second, I'm sorry for the typo, the second and the fourth compartments sharply off the capsule. You incise the capsule, and then you reduce and fix the fracture, and then you work from palmar to dorsal, or you work from radial to ulnar, or from ulnar to radial. So whatever is the easiest, you address that fragment first, and then you work your way. So it's like working with blocks or Meccano or Lego as you reconstruct the distal radius anatomy. And like I had mentioned, aforementioned, bone grafting should always be something that you should think of. I personally do not use artificial bone graft. I like to use Ilia-Crest bone graft. So here is a case in point. Again, this X-ray would not perhaps give you a clear idea as to what is going on, but just to discuss, I see that there is some comminution of the radial column. The intermediate column also, I can see that there is a large fragment here. And then I can also see a small or a moderate size ulnar corner dorsal fragment. The lateral view confirms that the volar cortex is intact. There is dorsal angulation and impaction. So I know that when I reduce the fracture, there's going to be a metaphyseal void, and I will be prepared for bone grafting. There is something going on with the ulnar styloid, but I will address that issue once I have reduced and fixed the distal radius component. So let us begin with the video. In such situations, it is always advisable to get a CT scan done. Now, the same fracture, the perspective changes completely when you look at the CT scan. So to a lot of minds, the X-ray picture might delude you into believing that this is something that is amenable to close reduction and percutaneous spinning. However, a CT scan will change the perspective completely, and this is something that you need to study the fracture anatomy and deal with it in an appropriate manner. So as we mentioned in the steps, we begin with a dorsal midline incision centered over the third ray or the Lister's tubercle. We like to raise full thickness skin flaps on either side of the incision, and we try to preserve and protect as many dorsal veins as possible so as to minimize postoperative edema. The dissection continues through the subcutaneous tissue until such time that we arrive at the extensor retinaculum. The dorsal sensory nerves along with the dorsal veins need to be protected. Here is a communicating tributary of the dorsal vein, which we will sacrifice. However, a branch of the cephalic vein on the radial aspect is being protected. The extensor retinaculum slowly starts coming into view, and that is the hematoma in the third extensor compartment. I'm tugging at the extensor pollicis longus, which will give me a guide to the third extensor compartment. The third extensor compartment is deroofed, and the extensor pollicis longus is retracted out of harm's way. We release the fascia a little bit more proximally so as to facilitate mobilizing the extensor pollicis longus so as to improve our visualization of the surgical field. We elevate the second extensor compartment, comprising of the extensor carpi radialis longus and the brevis, sharply using a 15 number blade and sharp osteotomes off the dorsal surface of the radius. And we do the same thing on the ulnar side, elevating the fourth extensor compartment. I like to recess the first dorsal compartment comprising of the abductor pollicis longus and the brevis, and then release the brachioradialis so that the reduction of the laterally displaced radial styloid fragment is facilitated and is eased out. We open the dorsal aspect of the distal radius using any osteoperiosteal bone fragments like the page of a book, and using McDonald's retractors or Dura separators, we elevate any impacted fragment, as you can see. So this is akin to elevating a Schatzker fragment. This is a bone graft. You can see a morcellized cancellous bone graft as well as a tricortical small peg bone graft for subchondral support. And you fill in the void with this bone graft. And then you use small bone tamps to impact the bone graft in place. And then you bring in a small plate for your provisional fixation. These are specialized pre-contoured plates. Like I said, you need to have the correct implants. And then all the while ascertaining that your implant position and reduction is optimum, you progress with your fixation. One caveat here to understand is that for any distal fracture, we should always remember that one plate often is not sufficient to address all fragments, be it the volar approach, be it the dorsal approach, and more often than not, you would end up using 2 or more plates. So here I'm using a pre-contoured radial styloid fragment plate. Also, I'm using a reverse L-shaped plate, and then the radial, the central and the ulnar fragments are addressed and stabilized in a buttress manner. Any dorsal comminuted fragments that are attached to the capsule are fixed back to the plate using braided non-absorbable sutures. The extensor compartments are closed in a manner that the implant is completely covered by soft tissue, thereby preventing any direct contact between the tendons and the implant, and thereby minimizing any risk of attritional rupture. And then the incision is closed over a drain with absorbable sutures. We tend to use 4-0 vicryl stitches. So this is where we began, and this is where we ended. This is a patient at around 1.5 years with a reasonable outcome. We always find that the volar flexion is restricted in a lot of patients because of perhaps the implants and the scarring on the dorsal side. I'm not sure if implant removal and tenolysis helps, but more often than not, they regain functional range of movement as well as almost comparable grip strength. Here is another patient where a dorsal approach will be used along with a volar approach. Now, note that the volar cortex is also fractured, and then there is a very large dorsal ulnar column fracture. Now, these are fractures where a volar plate may not be enough to address this particular fragment, and these are fractures that are what I call as outliers, where you need to identify the need for another additional dorsal approach. So a volar plate was applied to address the volar cortex fracture, and then a dorsal pre-contour plate was used to fix or to buttress the dorsal ulnar column. So in conclusion, dorsal approach to distal radius fractures is a viable option for patients with severe dorsally displaced fractures. And despite falling into disrepute in the initial stages where people talked about tendon attrition, where people talked about the implant being not perfect in shape and size, I think newer designs, low profile plates has promised to revive this procedure. I've always believed that fracture surgery is soft tissue surgery, wherein you address bony breach in integrity. And we need to carefully assess the fracture patterns with meticulous technique, respect to soft tissue, and this is what will account for good outcomes. So in summary, distal radius fractures will continue to challenge us right from our residency days to the most senior practitioner would deal with distal radius fractures, and we have to recognize that no two fractures are the same. We need to have a thorough understanding of our failures of fixation, and only these alone will help us improve our future successes. We need to carefully assess the fractures to determine what the optimal fixation should be for these fractures. Now, each fracture is unique and should be treated as such. And I would like to conclude by saying that it is a surgeon and his or her understanding of the fracture and how to fix it, and not the hardware, that makes up for an optimum outcome. And a similar analogy is with the adage that it is the wrist and not the sword that the warrior is respected for. So with that, I would like to thank the entire team for the opportunity to speak here. And I think I'll just end my, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abhijit. That was a very lucid talk, and I'm sure all of us enjoyed it, and you pulled it off in your unimitable style.
Thank you.
So it's very, very lucid and very informative. We'll take questions at the end, if that's all right. And now I would like to invite Professor Anil Bhatt, and he's going to be speaking on carpal tunnel and the surgery. He's going to show his real life videos, I think. So over to you, Professor Bhatt.
Thank you, Ravi. I'll share my screen now. Is it visible?
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Rajiv, Dr. Anup, and the Ortho TV, and of course, Abhijit and Ravi. This time I miss coming to Kolkata for the basic hand course. As usual, every year we do that, and hopefully next year we can do that. So this is a very, very common surgery all of us do, and always the problems happen in common surgeries, very routine surgeries, and so all the more care should be taken. I'm not as elegant as Abhijit doing a very difficult dorsal approach. These are very routine surgeries, but then I believe that we need to be very, very thorough with these routine surgeries so that we don't make the margin of mistakes should be very, very less in these kind of surgeries. So the treatment options basically, most carpal tunnel syndromes undergo conservative management. Majority of them, and they have to undergo at least in the beginning, with a good splint, NSAIDs, vitamin B. I put this figure, the photo of the splint, just to show that a lot of time the splints extend all the way till here, and then there's a lot of discomfort to the patient, sometimes even causing stiffness and other things. Make sure the splints stop at this level, at this point of the palmar crease here, so that the MCP flexion is not limited. Steroids are given sometimes orally also, but sometimes even a local ultrasound guided or a blind kind of steroid injections. The problem with them is a lot of times recurrence, and but then a good response to steroid means they would do good with the surgery also. The newer methods, there are some methods, the literature supports these, the nerve gliding exercises, tendon gliding exercises. We need to go look into that. And of course, finally, it's a surgical. And the surgical management is indicated at least 3 to 4 weeks of conservative treatment is done, and then it's not working for the patient. Most important is to rule out other conditions in the entire limb. So we need to examine these patients right from the neck down to the hand. All the things have to be ruled out when patient is not responding for whatever thought as carpal tunnel syndrome. But then patient is not responding. Make sure you rule out all of the causes right from, as I said, from the spine down. Now, surgical management falls into two categories, mainly open and endoscopic. And open also has different kinds of incisions. So the mini open is also one of the options. The open carpal tunnel release is the gold standard. Of course, almost 100 years back, it started the procedure itself. This is from anatomy, our own anatomy department, the dissection of the carpal tunnel, showing how it looks on an end-on view kind of view. And the carpal tunnel release, all of you do, and then most of the time can be done under local or brachial plexus or under general anesthesia. Now, the mini open came as a kind of, competition to endoscopic release. They said we can do the same way, shorter incision and other things. So this is the mini open, 1 centimeter kind of an incision. It's supposed to cause less post-op pain as compared to the open release, and equal efficacy to open release and also the endoscopic carpal tunnel release. Definitely not recommended for beginners, people who are just starting off their careers. Please do not try this, because you need to visualize the structures very well. As I said, the margin of error should be very, very less in a very routine surgery. And there should not be that this one particular patient undergoes some amount of injury or complications, and then the whole, surgical aspect becomes not a very good experience for both the patient and the surgeon. So I would not, I personally don't like this mini open release. Now, if you come to the open carpal tunnel release itself, now to start off with, basically it is a surgery where it's everything, the incision should be limited to the palm itself most of the times. So that is a thenar crease, and try to be ulnar to this thenar crease, about 6 millimeter ulnar to the thenar crease. That is your Kaplan's line coming in basically. And we try to keep there because one, the incision should not fall on the median nerve itself. The scar should not come there. Plus the palmar cutaneous branch. So protecting everything should be along the radial border of this ring finger here. And this is the other part of the Kaplan's lines showing the distal edge of the carpal tunnel itself. One more way of assessing the distal edge is something like this. The ring finger, when you flex, it just stops at this point. So that is the distal edge of your carpal tunnel, where you should not be crossing beyond this. This is the wrist crease, which you see here. And again, if you want to cross the wrist crease for any further matter, you need to go it as a crisscross like this towards the ulnar side like this again, because the palmar cutaneous branch comes somewhere at this point. So that's a skin incision, just generally about 2 to 3 centimeters of the incision here. You can shorten it as you become more experienced. There's a subcutaneous tissue coming in. Very rarely, sometimes there is a sensory branch of the ulnar nerve which can cross at the distal portion of this incision. To be careful with that. So just dissecting here is the flexor retinaculum, the outer layers of the palmar fascia itself. So just teasing out those fibers is good enough most of the time. And what you get here is the thickened portion of the transverse carpal ligament itself. Now, sometimes you might get this muscle tissue here. As you start dissecting there, and that is your palmaris brevis muscle. It just comes into picture sometimes. Sometimes the muscle itself is quite thick there. So that is the palmaris brevis, what we are looking at here. A very tiny muscle there, and it can be just overlying that area. And as you dissect out those fibers, what you get is the transverse carpal ligament extending. So the antebrachial fascia stops somewhere here. The flexor retinaculum is starting here all the way till it goes. And this portion is the thickened portion of the ligament, which is the transverse carpal ligament, what is told. And just a small nick there, very careful. And then you will see the change in color here. And that's where the nerve is. That is the synovium or the tendon sometimes, or the nerve itself. So that is all you need to do here. So make sure the moment you do that, you should protect all the structures which is underneath this throughout your surgery. So I put a McDonald's kind of a retractor here, and then protect all the structures underneath this, and then start cutting the transverse carpal ligament. Always use a 15 number blade, never 11 number blade. It's more dangerous. So always use a 50 number blade and tease out the fibers slowly and start cutting the transverse carpal ligament. Keep changing this position of this retractor, whichever you use, because sometimes it might go into the sheath of the tendon or the nerve. So be careful with that. So go all the way distally here. As you go distally, the transverse carpal ligament sometimes has a very distinct edge here, distal edge, but sometimes it might not, because of the normal anatomy itself. It's got a laminar kind of a configuration here, or a crisscross kind of a configuration, and merges with the rest of the flexor retinaculum here. So the moment you see this fat here, be careful, because that's where the superficial palmar arch and the digital branches are starting. You stop at that point, and that's the release. So that is the thickened edge of the transverse carpal ligament, what I'm lifting now. And then this is the surgery basically done now. What you need to do is also release the antebrachial fascia. You can change your position, come to this end, and just flex the wrist here, palmar flex, so that the nerve falls behind, and then under vision, you need to cut this antebrachial fascia here. Don't blindly push in your scissors into that. So if you retract, a lot of times these patients can have a deep aching pain here, or sometimes thenar wasting. So the recurrent branch of the median now might be going there sometimes, and it needs to be released. It has its own kind of a sheath sometimes. So that can be released. Otherwise, basically, the nerve is retracted, and I'm just looking at the tendons, and you see there's a lot of synovium here. This actually was a rheumatoid patient which we operated. All my patients undergo endoscopic release actually. Very rarely we do open release nowadays. But if there is another procedure to be done, then I would go for an open release. Check the floor of the tunnel itself here. Always look for any ganglions or any kind of any anomalous structures there. And as I said, if you want to extend the incision back to the wrist, you need to go with a zigzag kind of incision, never a straight incision like this here, because that would cause kind of a bad scar. Now this patient had a rheumatoid, so we went on to the wrist here to extend this incision here for tenosynovectomy. So this is the patient here, the nerve is retracted under this retractor. There's all extra lot of synovium which we wanted to send for biopsy, and also do a synovectomy for the patient. So that is the rheumatoid patient, and if you want to do a tenosynovectomy, you can do it very nicely, but you need to extend the incision if you want to see all the structures nicely, all the tendons nicely. So that is a basic surgery of open carpal tunnel release. Now, if you come to the endoscopic release, it could be a single or double portal technique. It's got a steep learning curve. You need to be careful. And very, very importantly, the surgeon should have a very low threshold to abort and convert to open procedure at any point of time when he's in doubt about visualizing the structures, or he thinks he's not able to perform the surgery completely. Definitely, you need to take consent for both endoscopic and open release for all the patients. This is the basic instrumentation I use. It's a single portal technique, and it's got this camera here. This is the blade here, and this is a scope here. The basic camera attachment which you use for other scopes. These are the dilators here. All these three. This is a synovial elevator, and these are the dilators which go in. So this is the basic instrumentation which is used for this particular procedure. Now, if to assemble this, basically you put in the scope into this here. It's like a gun mechanism. So you can use this for both right and left side. So this is where this is a disposable blade. So we put in the blade there, and then tighten the blade at the top like this. Once it is done, checked. If you just that is the blade where it comes out. So if you press this button there, this blade comes out here, and this is done only when you have to cut the transverse carpal ligament. So the basic camera attachment of any kind of a scope, arthroscope. So that is what it is, and the light source there. Both are used for this particular instrument. They're very convenient kind of endoscopic gadget. This is the basic thing. So if you want to go for the right side, you go, or if you want to go to the other side, you just have to turn this, take away loosen the knob and turn the scope, and you can use it for the opposite hand. So this is the basic thing for using both sides, right side or to the left side. So this is the instrument assembly, what I'm showing now. And then the landmarks are basically, you can use a wide incision like this. This is the FCR and the FCU. The incision is basically between the FCR and the FCU incision. Normally, our incisions would be between the FCR and the palmaris longus here on to this side. So as I said, be more towards the ulnar side. So that's why I'm telling that use a wider incision. This is the the wrist crease here at this point, and that is their pisiform coming in here on this side, and that is the hook of the hamate. So I'm just drawing the landmarks here of the transverse carpal ligament itself. And as I said, always the Kaplan's interval is the one which we need to use along the radial side of the ring finger here. That is the first one. And this is the other line which is along the first web crease here. So I've not drawn the line here, but that is the junction. That tells the distal edge of the transverse carpal ligament. So the incision can be as long as here. I don't usually go along the wrist crease itself. I go proximal to the wrist crease so that when the patient moves later on, the scar should not be staying there. So that is the idea of trying to take a slightly more proximal kind of an incision, not at the wrist crease itself. Now that is a deep fascia coming in there. So you just dissect out the deep fascia here and make a small U-shaped kind of a flap here to lift it up so that you can pass your scope. So that is, I'm just showing this. Normally we don't do all these markings. I straight away take a U-shaped flap here. And if they're coming in the way of their scope, you can always excise that forearm fascia. But this is the basic technique, classic textbook technique described. So I'm just showing each of these steps. So underneath will be the nerve there. The palmaris longus comes in there, and then you have the nerve just between that. So this is the U-shaped forearm flap, which is raised, facial flap, which is raised like that, and just hold it there, and then you have the you can visualize the nerve there underneath this. So gently remove that. If you want, you can take off this flap completely. So that is a flap which goes back there and it sits there. And then your procedure starts wherein you start dilating the tunnel itself. So this is the first synovial dissector. So if there are any facial bands here, synovial are kind of a projections, all this is dissected with this. It's not a rough, I mean, it's a very blunt instrument actually. And these are the dilators. So as you go through, you feel the hook of the hamate and it curves along that, and you get a washboard kind of a feel as you go through that. The rough edge of the transverse carpal ligament is felt actually through these dilators. So there are two sizes. There are actually three sizes. They're actually called the hamate finder. So once you do that, you're convinced, then you introduce the scope. At any point of time, again, if it's very tight, repeat the entire procedure. Don't try to push in the scope forcibly. Keep the wrist extended slightly like this, about 10 to 20 degrees. That will make your life easy, and you can see till where, and your light should stop at this point. And this is the endoscopic procedure here. As you go inside here, you would see this transverse fibers here. So that tells you that you're in the right area. If you don't see those transverse fibers like this, means maybe you're not in the sometimes people have entered the Guyon's canal also. So be careful with that. You should see those transverse fibers of the ligament very nicely all the way there. Remember, the scope is not to explore the tunnel. It is just to go and cut the transverse carpal ligament, nothing else. And so if you see the distal edge very clearly, that is where you need to put your blade and start. You can confirm from the top. You push your thumb there and you will see the fat here just distal to that. So once you get that distal edge at this point, you start incising the ligament. You sometimes a single, if it's a very nice transverse carpal ligament, a single cut is good enough. Otherwise, sometimes like this, you might have to use multiple cuts, but make sure that you don't go distal to what you've marked. So keep your thumb on the palm like this always in the other hand, and make sure you don't cross that. So that is the cut edge of the ligament here. And distal 2/3 is released, and I'm coming towards the proximal side. So this was again what I showed you, the palmaris brevis popping in now. Once the transverse carpal ligament, in the open release, we saw it from the top. Now what you're seeing is from the underside of the muscle itself. So this is the proximal edge as you come out like this. And if there are any few fibers left, you can just go in and cut it there. All happens both with visual and your touch kind of a feedback. So that is very, very important. So if there are any fibers there, cut it off. That is the distal edge there, few fibers remaining there. And once you finish this, you just inspect the cut edge. That's a complete release happened. So you can just inspect the cut edge of the ligament. As I said, don't explore the tunnel. Don't go and try. So this is the cut edge of the ligament, nicely seen now on this side and the other side. Don't try to explore and see for the nerve itself. So you need to stop that. And once the procedure is done, take it out. And the same procedure of cutting the antebrachial fascia has to be done with this. So once you come out, as I said, antebrachial fascia under vision, cut through it by retracting the skin nicely here and cut through the whole thing till you don't get any resistance. Now sometimes there might be technical problems like this patient now. The distal edge is not very clearly seen. It's very kind of a mushy kind of a endpoint there. So the poor definition of distal edge is one of the indications to abort the procedure and come out and do an open procedure. So I'm trying to go slightly distally and try to see if I can see, but if you see compared to the previous case, nothing is seen there and a lot of fluid there in this. So these are the patients you should not try to go because the digital branches are very, very close by. So you need to stop and abort this. As you get experience, you can do this under local anesthesia also. This is under the local anesthesia. We have used a tourniquet here, but then this is kind of a differential block we have used here. And you can check after your procedure is done. I just do these markings nowadays. I don't draw the whole thing. I just and I ask the patient to move the fingers the moment the procedure is done so that I know I've not damaged any of these. So under local anesthesia also it can be done for these patients. Now, post-op protocol for both the procedures, just a week of immobilization, dressing, bulky dressing, start mobilizing with a splint by about 1 week, start light work by about 3 weeks, and use the night splint especially. Scar massage and hand therapy is very important. Complications seen in both the procedures, scar hypertrophy, tenderness, and sometimes injury to the nerve or a tendon or a CRPS type 2 can happen. And persistent pain and recurrence are one of the common complications. Now, evidence between endoscopic release and open carpal tunnel release, they say equally efficacious in terms of overall importance. There's a Cochrane review of almost 2,586 hands published in 2014. The endoscopic release shows better pain improvement in the short term. And when we tell short term, it's the first 3 weeks, but a lot of times this first 3 weeks is also very crucial for the patient. And patient undergoing ECTR returned to work an average of about a week earlier. That's what the study says. And also those who are undergoing endoscopic showed improvement in recovery of grip strength in the long term. So this is what the evidence says. Now, again, another meta-analysis of almost 13 RCTs more frequently resulted in transient nerve problems in terms of complications, but OCTR or the open carpal tunnel release resulted in wound complications more frequently. But the rate of recurrence and the need for repeat surgery again is comparable. So that is the basic evidence between these two procedures here. I'll just show when a patient comes with a wasting of the thenar muscles completely. Sometimes we do a primary tendon transfer. It's called the Kamitz transfer, where we use the palmaris longus. So that is the palmaris longus, and it continues again as the palmar fascia. So that palmaris longus is harvested along with this aponeurosis, palmar aponeurosis, and it's given to the abductor pollicis brevis here for opponents. So when patient has very bad wasting, thenar wasting and motor kind of a deficit, this kind of a procedure is used along with the carpal tunnel release. So we release the carpal tunnel. If you see, this is the palmar. I mean, I've just wrapped the tendon here with this. So this is the nerve here. Basically, if you see, it's a nice thick, compression of the nerve. You can see at this point here. It's kind of hourglass kind of a deformity here, proximal swelling here, and so and complete wasting of the thenar eminence. I am sure you can appreciate that. This is the proximal swelling we always see in the carpal tunnel. And this is the graft which has been harvested here along with the part of the palmar fascia. You see the superficial palmar arch nicely here, and the only problem with this kind of a tendon transfer is most all opponents, or rather opponents plasties, have to have a pulley system here on the ulnar side for them, for the thumb to work very nicely. And this is one procedure where we don't have a pulley system. So it's not a very good tendon transfer in that sense, because it just goes directly like this. A pulley here would take this kind of a momentum, the lever here very nicely, and then give a good opposition. So that is the one drawback of this tendon transfer here. And then it is sutured to the abductor pollicis brevis here, and also to the joint capsule here to give a good amount of opposition for these patients. So along with the primary carpal tunnel release, when patient has severe motor deficit, this can be used as an additional. You need to talk to the patient, and you need to counsel them. And if they want immediate motor kind of a recovery, this is one of the way you can give them the opposition of the thumb straight away for these patients. So it's a very, because it's a single incision and it can be done quickly. A lot of times it's recommended, but not routinely. You can still release the nerve and wait for the recovery. But if there are many years elapsed between the start of the carpal tunnel syndrome itself, then probably this would be a wise way of doing the carpal tunnel release itself. Okay, so that is the basic tendon transfer, and the thumb sits nicely with a good opposition there. You need to adjust the tension in such a way that it gives a good opposition for the patient. So in summary, the diagnosis is predominantly clinical, and investigations is basically to know the altered anatomy and physiology like NCB and all, but your diagnosis is always clinical. Remember, always examine right from the neck down to the hand to rule out other conditions. Treatment is based on patient symptom severity, and complications are uncommon, but it can be quite devastating for the patient. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anil. That was an excellent presentation, and as I said, you make things so simple and so clear. And Anil is a born teacher. That's why we love having him here every year, and we don't want to let him. Too bad about the pandemic, but I'm sure we'll have him. I mean, I've given him honorary, West Bengal citizenship. That's it's one of us.
Rajiv has to agree for that now.
Okay. So we'll take questions at the end, and with that, we'll move on to Dr. Anup Agarwal. I would request him to start his presentation. He's going to speak on perilunar dislocation. That's it. Yeah. Over to you, Dr. Agarwal.
Yeah. So basically, I'll be speaking on scapholunate dissociation. So this is the one case example where I had this 19-year-old male. He was a resident of USA studying yoga in Haridwar. He kept on complaining of pain and rest while putting weight or extreme movement for last 4 to 5 months. He went to different orthopedic surgeons. So this was the X-ray which was done. Looks quite normal in X-ray, and he was given some painkillers and rest and everything. So what actually went wrong? That proper examination was not done. So in any case, proper examination is very important in any case. So on examination, what I found was there was a tenderness dorsally over radiocarpal joint, and there was a slight sound of shift on pressing over the anatomical snap box. So I got there is something wrong over there with the scaphoid. So I came up with some differential diagnosis that it could be a fracture or subluxation or avascular necrosis of some bone, probably a scaphoid, or it could be a ligament injury, tear, or it could be tendinopathy, which is causing this kind of problem, pain, or this problem. So I again looked back this X-ray and found that this AP X-ray is not a true AP X-ray actually, and this is not a true lateral X-ray. So the lesson number 2 with this is that you need to get a proper X-ray done. So as soon as you get a proper AP done, you start looking, there is something wrong. So this is the proper AP and proper lateral X-ray done. And this similar kind of finding could have been confirmed by this MRI, which confirms. So after seeing something wrong on X-ray, you presume a diagnosis, and to confirm, you get further either CT and MRI, and you get this confirmed. So before jumping on to diagnosis of this, a bit of anatomy and kinematics about the wrist. We all know there is a proximal row, there is a distal row, and this makes certain arc. There's a first arc, second concave arc, third arc, And this needed to be maintained if we look at the AP X-ray. And if you try to understand the kinematics of actually wrist, the capitate is the center of rotation and lunate is in a dynamic state where triquetral usually goes into extension in rest movement and scaphoid goes into flexion. And if you see the force of transmission, it is from capitate, lunate, scaphoid. To 25% of force is transmitted to ulna and 75 to the radius. So basically lunate is the center of attraction. It is in a dynamic balance with the scaphoid and triquetral. And here lies the problem if anything goes wrong in the scaphoid, lunate or triquetral. So this is what I told actually. So if you see the lateral X-ray, what you find is that usually the excess of the lunate, capitate and the second metacarpal and radius is one side. And if you look at the axis of the scaphoid, it makes 45 degree of angle with this with the capitolunate axis. And if there is any wrong with the scapholunate ligament, what happens? The scaphoid flexes and lunate extend or dorsiflex, and there is an increase in scapholunate angle, which is about 105. So anything beyond 60 is abnormal. On the other side, when you have an opposite thing, that is volar intercalated segmental disability, it is the scaphoid which get extended and lunate flexes, and scapholunate angle get decreased below 30 degree, and that's an abnormal, and you call it VC or volar intercalated segment instability. So now look at this X-ray. What we find that on an AP radiograph, there is a gap between scapholunate. That's typical of Terry-Thomas sign. Then you have a cortical ring sign, and this can be again confirmed on this. And if you look at the lateral view, you could draw all these lines and see, and you find the scapholunate axis is more than 60. So a typical scapholunate ligament tear is basically it can present with an occult or a dynamic scapholunate dissociation, and then lead to carpal collapse, and then ultimately leads to slat. So this is how the progression of disease actually happens. So if you classify them, that could be dissociative, non-dissociative, complex, and adaptive. In fact, if you see all this classification itself is complex and difficult to understand. But the basic thing is a scapholunate angle which you need to understand. And if you see, there is in scapholunate instability, it is the complete disruption of scapholunate ligament. Scaphoid flexes, lunate and triquetrum rotate into extension, and this is a typical dorsal intercalated segment instability. So how you actually classify these carpal instability, that this could be dynamic, because you can have a negative X-ray and positive on strectine. You could have an static, you will find it on every plain film. It could be degenerative, or it could be secondary, where you can have ultimately lunate's avascular necrosis also. So how to treat this? You can have a direct open repair with K-wire fixation for the fresh. For the degenerative or for later presentation, you have Brunelles's and many modifications of Brunelles's, or you could have 3 ligament tenodesis, or you can have a blood capsulodesis. What I am going to show you in this video is, I'll just shift it, not take the video in this, I'll shift it to video directly. What I'm going to show you on this video is actually a modification of Brunelli. So this is the dorsally, we opened the same way that has been told, just about a 3 centimeter on this, and you straight away reach to the extensor retinaculum. You cut it between the second, third compartment, and here you need to careful. You could see this extensor carpi radialis here, and you retract it laterally and try to locate the point line.
We are not able
let me tell you, in a chronic SL instability, the tissues are very tough, and it is very difficult actually to demarcate and in fact cut those fibrous tissue. So you keep palping.
We are not able to see the video. The video is not running. Could you please check?
It's running on my this thing.
No, Anup,
Yeah.
I think you should run it separately.
Okay. Okay.
It's not running here.
I think. Okay. So can you see this video now?
Yeah. Make it in presentation mode. And now it will run. You have to click here on the play.
Is it resume share? Okay. Let me do this. Sorry. I think what's happening is this visible?
It is visible. Make it in share presentation mode, then it will run. Presentation mode.
Yeah.
From this slide only, yes. And now click on the video, left side arrow.
Okay.
Yes, it's running. Yes.
Visible now?
Yes.
I hope.
Done.
I'm so sorry for that. So this is on the dorsal aspect. We're cutting the retinaculum in the second, third compartment. Now, as soon as you cut, you get to the capsule. So this you have cut the reticulum, you have retracted the extensor carpi radialis. And now this is the area where all the tissues are very tough. So you have to be very, very careful once you're cutting onto this side. So you try to locate and then cut the tissue. So what I'm trying to make is trying to cut the superficial tissue, and as soon as I reach, I try to have the capsule and fibrous tissue and try to make a flap of it actually. And now you have reached and you immediately able to see the scapholunate dislocation. And now I've shifted onto the volar side and make a small incision 2 centimeter on the volar side. And this is FCR, which you can see. Retract it laterally. And then you cut the capsule after locating it. Now this finger is at the distal aspect of the radius, distal border of the radius. And all this tissue is very difficult to cut because it's all fibrosis and capsulodesis which has happened on this. And now I'm trying to open up the FCR to harvest the part of it for tendon reconstruction. This now again I have shifted onto the dorsal aspect, and it's a typical movement which you do. You put one K wire into the scaphoid and one K wire into lunate. So one K wire has been put into lunate, another will be put into the axis of the scaphoid. And this is how you move it. And dislocation is reduced when you pass K wire from scaphoid to lunate to fix this dissociation. And you cross check it. Now again, I have come on to the volar aspect after fixing the dissociated scapholunate. So you have to clear up all this soft tissue. This wire is at the distal edge of the radius. That's the radial joint, wrist joint. And now I'm making a point to drill a hole into scaphoid for passing the ligament, passing the tendon. So basically you have to make two holes, one into the scaphoid and another into the lunate. And you need to be careful that you don't fracture. Now this is how from proximal to distal you harvest the part of FCR, which is about 3 to 4 mm, and completely do it till the base of the second metacarpal where it is attached. And now I'm trying to stitch the end of it so that I can pass this harvested tendon through the holes made in scaphoid and lunate. So this is, now I passed it from scaphoid coming onto the dorsal side. And this is the actually most difficult part because your hole is approximately 3 mm. I do it with the 3 mm K wire, and sometimes it becomes difficult actually to pass that. Oh, I think is this what happened? There's something wrong. It's a replate. I'm so sorry. So this was where we were trying to pass the ligament. So we have come on to the dorsal aspect, trying to pull it back. Now from dorsal aspect, it has come out of from scaphoid, and I'll now pass it through the lunate. This is what I'm trying to pass it through the hole in lunate. And once I pass it, I bring it on the volar aspect, and this is a one hole. This is a hole which has been made into the distal edge of radius, the K wire which you can see, and it is being so this is the end of tendon which has come, and it is now fixed. Sutured it back to itself.
Okay.
So this completes the surgery. This is the post-op X-ray of the patient. This is the post-op movement. This is approximately 3 months, which are the movement of the patient. I'm so sorry for this video which stopped working in between.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agarwal. Despite the video glitch, I think we could follow most of the procedure. And
I hope so.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. We'll take questions at the end, and I think I'm the next batsman. If that's
Yes.
I'll go ahead and share my screen. So I'm going to talk about dorsal fracture dislocations of the PIP joint. So we're going proximal to distal. I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me for a second. Okay, so the PIP joint anatomy is like a box comprising of the proper and the accessory collateral ligaments and the volar plate and the Chekrian ligaments. We have to have a fundamental understanding of this joint anatomy before we take on treatment of these injuries. Most important thing which I'd like to emphasize is trying to get a true lateral view. And inherently, if you have less than 40% of the articular margin of the volar lip, then it is stable. And if it's more than 40%, then it tends to be unstable, and you need some additional sort of stabilization method. So this is a fundamental understanding. With that, I'll go straight away into the video. This is a Suzuki frame application. The patient in question is a young gentleman. He's 12-day-old injury, PIP joint fracture dislocation. You can see about 30% of the articular surface has been involved, and there's a dorsal dislocation, fracture dislocation. The first step is we pass a 1 millimeter long K-wire. These are 9 millimeter K-wires passed transversely to the center of the head of the proximal phalanx under C-arm guidance. Now we'll zoom out to see, you can see the entire length of the K-wire. So it's dead in the center of the head of the proximal phalanx, confirmed under C-arm. The next step is to bend it into the form of a U on both sides. So we bend the wire at 90 degrees to create the frame to form a U-shaped shape. So it's done symmetrically on both sides. Once that's done, the second K-wire is passed in the distal part of the middle phalanx, again under C-arm guidance, checking all the way and slowly advance. So we have two wires. And once the second wire is passed, this is also fashioned in a similar way to create a U. So this is a zoomed out view. This will also be bent in the similar fashion on both sides, symmetrically in the same plane to form another U shape. The idea is to create a dynamic fixator using simple K-wires and rubber bands, and this is very versatile, and I think every orthopedic surgeon who deals with these kind of injuries should have a working knowledge of this method and the use of this fixator. It's very simple. So you can fine tune it a little bit to create a perfect U. So this is what's being done, and you have the proximal, which is wide. Then the next thing is basically you fashion hooks at the end of the K-wires to attach the rubber band. So this is how you bend them, both the proximal and the distal K-wires, which you have bent in this fashion as been shown on the screen. This is the appearance after you've added the hooks. The next step is to add the rubber bands to create the dynamic assembly. And the important thing is the distance between these hooks should be at least about an inch, about 2 to 2.5 centimeters for the dynamic assembly to work and adequate tension to be generated on the rubber bands to provide the distraction force. So this is the final completed assembly. Now, sometimes what happens is an additional third transverse wire can be added to prevent the dorsal joint subluxation. And this has been passed below the proximal wire, and that prevents the dorsal dislocation. This is the final view. You can see it on C-arm, lateral view, and then again the AP view. And then we can check the assembly under C-arm under continuous screening to see that it is stable. The beauty of this construct is very simple, and it is dynamic, and it maintains the reduction. And this is the completed assembly. And you can see this is the one, this is the proximal wire which has been bent into a U. Then once that's done on both sides, bent into a hook on both sides. And then you have the distal wire to the middle phalanx, 1 millimeter wire which has been bent into a similar fashion, again formed into a U. and both are connected by rubber bands, which are providing the dynamic traction. And sometimes addition of the third transverse wire to prevent the dorsal subluxation of the joint is a useful addition. So this can be done for fresh cases, and it's a very useful tool in every hand surgeon's armamentarium. It's minimally invasive, it's percutaneous, you don't need very fancy equipment or setups, no need for any complex exposures, and it is dynamic and can be done under local anesthesia, and the patient can actually go home in a few hours. Now, I'm going to talk, the next talk is about hemihamate arthroplasty. Whenever there's a delayed presentation with a large fragment, and the use of this principle is to use the graft from the hamate which matches the same articular surface of the middle phalanx, and this is used to reconstruct the articular surface of the proximal, the base of the middle phalanx. So this is a patient who presented 4 months old. There's only a painful jog of movement, the wrist, the finger was stiff. The approach we use is the Hastings approach. Now this starts like a Brunner approach more distally and curves across the finger, and then we follow the mid-axial approach here in over the crease, and then we curve it again like a Brunner's. So it is like a trapezoidal incision which we use. This is the Hastings approach. And now next, this is we're using a 15 blade to do the dissection very gently. We have to be careful because it's the ulnar neurovascular bundle which we shall encounter very shortly. We use fine dissecting scissors. Careful dissection leads to elevation of the skin flap. Be very careful. A peanut swab is very useful to dab and give you a good view while you are dissecting. You can see straight away the ulnar neurovascular bundle has come into view there. You can see the ulnar neurovascular bundle. It's very carefully dissected and retracted. The next thing which we see is the flexor tendon sheath covering the flexor tendons. The dissection is continued on, and the radial neurovascular bundle is actually taken along with the skin flap by gentle dissection, and that's what's done. You can see the flexor tendon with the covering sheath there. The next step is to cut a flap of flexor tendon. You raise it as a flap and reflect it on to the radial side. So that's what we're going to proceed to do. You can see here that a flap of the flexor sheath has been raised. We are gently reflecting it, and this is done between the A2 and the A4 pulleys. And now what we can see the flexor tendon, that is the FDS which comes into view, FDP, and below that is the FDS, both slips. The sheath is raised very carefully, and then you have the two flexor tendons there. The next important thing is to be very careful and retract the tendons to either side so that we can work on the volar plate and the collateral ligaments, both of which are very crucial to adequate exposure. So now you can see that the flexor tendons have been retracted to the radial side, and this brings the volar capsule and the volar plate into view. So the idea is to use a sharp 15 blade to cut the volar plate as distally as possible, and that's what we are doing right now. And the collateral ligaments are erased off as proximally as possible from the head of the proximal phalanx. So this is proceeding with the volar plate release. We have retracted the flexor tendons to the radial side. Now we are working on the volar plate from the ulnar aspect. We're doing the release as distally as possible. Now you can see the joint also coming into view. You can see the underlying bone. Once we have completed the release on one side, we can again switch the retractors to retract the flexor tendons to the ulnar side, and then we can work on the volar plate from the radial aspect also. Patience is the key, a little bit at a time. It's always good to use loop magnification. So you can see the volar plate is now being released on the radial side. This time the flexor tendons have been retracted ulnarwards. And the next step is to free up and recess the collateral ligaments from the head of the proximal phalanx on both sides, the radial and the ulnar aspect. This is crucial to mobilization of the joint, because the next step is we are going to shotgun the joint open. So unless the collateral ligaments are recessed and the volar plate is completely released, it will not be possible to expose the joint adequately. So you can see the collateral ligaments are being recessed here, and that is being erased off. Now the next step is to retract the tendons. This is where you take a leap of faith, and now the joint is being shotgunned open. Do that very carefully and gently. Just like the breech of a shotgun, now the joint is completely open, bringing into view the fracture dislocation. You can see the head of the proximal phalanx there with the articular cartilage intact. And you can see the base of the middle phalanx, and over the volar aspect is the fracture irregular area with the loss of cartilage there. The dorsal aspect seems to be satisfactory. The cartilage there, it seems to be okay. It's the volar, about more than 40% of the joint has been involved, almost 50%. Next step is to measure the defect so that we know what size of graft we're going to need. Once the measurement is done, the idea is to prepare the bed with the saw. One technical tip is to make the saw cut with the graft in mind, and not just follow the previous fracture malunion site. So you make the saw cut with a fine micro sagittal saw, holding it very carefully, keeping the graft in mind. You make a transverse and a horizontal cut in such a way that it will seat the graft quite nicely. Again, very high degree of control, and you need to be very gentle with and precise with your saw cuts. Then once again we measure the defect after the osteotomy has been made, and the next step is to plan the incision for the hemi-hamate autograft. And the incision is marked. You can use Siam guidance if required. Then the graft is, the site is exposed, the hamate. You can see the 4th and 5th CMC with the hamate, and then the graft is raised from the hamate. We have planned the size of the defect and marked it on the hamate. So once we've made it, the completion of the graft harvest is done using a fine curved chisel from the ulnar aspect. This is the osteocartilaginous graft from the hamate which we have harvested, and that actually mimics the articular surface of the base of the middle phalanx. And this is the graft which has been shaped and measured and provisionally fixed with the K-wire. The next step is to secure the graft with 1.3 millimeter screws. So we are drilling, then we are measuring, and then we are using adequate size 1.3 millimeter screws to secure the graft. The length of the screws is very mandatory. You don't want the screws to be sticking out on the dorsal aspect and causing problems with irritation of the extensor tendon. So usually 2 or 3 screws are needed to secure the graft. It's imperative that the graft is very firmly fixed with the screws, because for rehabilitation and early mobilization, we have to have a very stable fixation. That's what is being done. We are using mini screws, the screwdriver. The screw heads are made flush with the bone, and the screw length is very important. We don't want to make the screws too long. You can see that the joint is being reconstructed, and now that's the graft which has been shaped and held with 3 screws. That's the lateral view. We can see the articular surface has been reconstructed quite nicely. And this is the AP view. And then we proceed to close in the standard fashion, repair the volar plate, replace the flexor tendons. We can interpose the flap which we had raised in between the screws and the tendon, and that will give some protection against flexor tendon irritation. And this is after the skin closure with interrupted 4-ethylon sutures. And the final function, 3 months follow-up, a little bit of swelling at the PIP joint, but got a good grip, and that completes the procedure. So in summary, what I can say is with PIP joint dislocations, the diagnosis is very important, and we need to be careful in diagnosing them. So we need to be, if one thing I would like to say as a take-home message, it is important to get a true lateral view of every finger injury. simply getting an oblique view of the whole hand will not do. Once we've diagnosed it, then we have to identify which strategy would be the best. The Suzuki frame is a very useful and a very simple technique, which I think every orthopedic surgeon, it should be a part of your armamentarium. The hemihamate arthroplasty is reserved for more complex, situations where it's a delayed presentation and, it's more of a salvage procedure. Probably the reason why I presented it here is Rajiv wanted me to share it as an option, and just for the sake of, letting everybody know that there are reconstructive options. That's the only reason why I shared this video. And with that, I think come to an end of my presentation. So I'll hand over to Rajiv again to take questions and conduct the rest of the meeting.
Thank you, Ravida. Excellent demonstration. So now we will take question. Anup, do you have any question?
I have a question with, not question, actually few comments with Abhijit. No, it's an excellent video presentation and importance of being shown the dorsal approach and dorsal plating. Actually, for many of the surgeons, even as on today, understanding the 3-column concept and importance of dorsal comminution in a distal radius fracture. So there are 3 important factors, I think, that one need to understand the 3 columns of distal radius, need to check for the dorsal comminution and the depressive fragment, which is very, very critical. I think these are the 3 things which are very, very important for any type of distal radius fracture, because even the depressed fracture are often missed and are not properly elevated by few of the surgeons, and that actually create a lot of problem.
So there is one question for Dr. Abhijit. So when you are putting a radial column plate, whether you put it through extra-articular approach or through the second window only, what is the preferred technique?
Yeah, so what Agarwal sir said is very pertinent. It's very important to understand the 3-column concept of Reckley and Regazzoni as was propagated by them. And it is not only the 3 columns, it is also the subcomponents of the rim and the lip, both on the dorsal as well as the volar side. And I think that perhaps is the most convenient way of addressing distal radius fracture in a conceptual manner rather than the AO classification. Personally, I find it easier. And then on the radial side or on the volar side, so whether you're using a volar or a dorsal approach, I like to release the brachioradialis through the same incision, and then the plate could also could be dorsoradial, completely radial, or maybe a volar kind of a radial kind of. So that gives you that play, because it is S-shaped kind of a plate. The buttressing effect can be accomplished by placing the plate in such a manner that the plate and the screws do not interfere with the other plate. So you just need to play around with it a little bit, and then using the sleeve attached to the plate makes it easier, and you can place it in an appropriate manner. I hope that answers the question.
So there's one question on YouTube for Ravida. So when do you remove the Suzuki frame?
I usually remove it between 3 to 4 weeks. By that time, the fracture is sticky, but I would always get another check X-ray, and then it's a simple procedure. You can remove it in the clinic. And unless sometimes, there have been instances where there's been earlier pin track infection, but even that salvage, because the Suzuki frame has done its job by then, and you can even supplement in a dorsal blocking splint if you need to remove the pins earlier.
And for the hemihamate arthroplasty, so your mobilization is immediate mobilization, or you use some hinge?
Yes, I didn't actually want to share this here, but it's basically this is a procedure which I just wanted to present as an option. It is, there are many options, and hemihamate is probably one which there are a lot of technical aspects, and one has to be very careful in selecting the correct patient. And the rehab protocol is probably as important as the surgery. While it is precision surgery, your choice of patient, his or her own motivation, and the follow-up, it's very mandatory. It's probably one surgery where the rehab is, most of the hand surgery is like that, but even more so in a hemihamate, The rehab is very crucial, and the patient's participation in the rehab is very essential to get a good result. The hemihamate just offers you an option to recreate the joint and make the X-ray look good, but the follow-up is what is going to determine the ultimate functional result. Having said that, there are many other ways without a hemihamate arthroplasty. There are specific indications. You could do a volar plate arthroplasty, which is probably simpler. You could get an equally good functional result. So there are separate criteria for choice of each procedure, but rehab is crucial. Yes, Abhijit.
Yes, Abhijit.
Yeah, just a point that I wanted to make. That was an excellent demonstration about the hemihamate. One trick that I learned from Randy Bindra was, the FDS can be slit in the midline from the decussation, the campus chiasma, a little bit proximal. So it becomes a lot easier to play between the tendons, and retracting it. Sometimes it becomes so difficult to retract the FDP and the FDS together. And then if you slit it, you could use one slip on either side and, makes it easier.
Yep.
Just so that, Thank you.
One issue is that when we are doing a dorsal plating with bone grafting, Abhijit, when you are closing the second and fourth compartment, usually closure comes in lots of tension. So how to avoid tension in that closing of the second and fourth compartment, which you have elevated subperiosteum?
Yeah. I think a lot has to do with extremely meticulous exposure. It begins with exposure. So we like to wait for about a week so that the edema reduces and you don't face that problem. That's exactly the point I was trying to make. And then it is almost never a fracture. And close to almost every fracture that I've done so far, I have never ever had that problem. Else, you could use a slip, a flap of the extensor retinaculum, underneath the tendon. So you make a Z-shaped kind of a retinacular flap and use one of those flaps underneath the extensor tendons to protect those tendons from the plate. But if you wait for a while, if you do meticulous dissection, sharp dissection, if you raise the subsheath of the extensor compartments, that's not a problem usually. One more point I wanted to make. Can I make one more very quick point? So
yes,
what
please.
Anup Agarwal sir also showed, or distal radius. So whenever we do this dorsal approach, we also usually we do a neurectomy of the terminal branches of the posterior intraosseous nerve through the same incision. We find it at the base of between the fourth and the fifth extensor compartments. So for distal radius fractures, as you raise the compartment of the distal radius, you will find the posterior intraosseous nerve along with the posterior intraosseous artery. Whereas when you're doing it for the scapholunate, we just retract the tendons a little proximal to the retinaculum between the fifth and the fourth extensor compartments, and you'll find the posterior intraosseous nerve right there. And then you just take off the terminal branches with with an electrocautery bipolar, and that kind of deals with the pain in a lot of patients.
And there's one question on Facebook. If you raise the brachioradialis, whether you need to reattach it or just leave it there?
Great question. So we keep getting this question from a lot of people every time we talk about recessing or releasing the brachioradialis. Now understand that right from its insertion to the origin, the brachioradialis has a lot of attachments to the radius. In fact, when we have to do a tendon transfer brachioradialis to the FPL in median nerve palsy, you have to release the brachioradialis way back proximal to increase the excursion. So if you release the brachioradialis distally at its insertion, it really doesn't retract. It just stays there. And it will scar down to whatever place it is, kind of remaining, or it reattaches. So you don't even have to really reattach that fragment. So releasing the brachioradialis not only makes the maneuver of reducing the radial striated fracture fragment easy, it also gives you space to place your plate, and there is no problem with kind of resuturing and reattaching it. So it just scars back wherever it is and doesn't cause any functional deficit. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes. Anil Bhatt sir, there is a question. on YouTube. So when we are releasing carpal tunnel in chronic cases, do you need to do a neurolysis of the median nerve also, or in some? What are the conditions you in which you want to do neurolysis of the median nerve?
Most of the time it's not needed. In fact, I don't think anybody actually does neurolysis or epineurotomy or any of those things. Literature has proven that there's absolutely no difference between doing any of these procedures, and also you might actually damage the nerve. So it's always better to just release the transcarpal ligament and let it recover on its own. So there's no role for any kind of those procedures at all. So I would advise not to do it actually, and just leave the nerve alone. And
And what about deroofing it? Sometimes people deroof it, take a strip of in open procedure. So during carpal tunnel release, after releasing, they just take a strip of transverse carpal ligament. Would you recommend that?
Absolutely not necessary. Again, there's no again, none of the literature tells that there might be bowstringing. Earlier, people used to immobilize carpal tunnel syndrome after release for a long time, thinking that things will bowstring. So all those has been disproven. There's absolutely no evidence for those things. So we mobilize them early. We don't. Some people again do a Z-plasty kind of thing and try to. So all those will actually cause more scarring, and you might actually cause impingement of the nerves and the gliding of the tendons itself. So always just, if it's an endoscope, just go cut the transcarpal ligament, come out. If it's an open, again, just do that. Check the canal, because you opened it, check the tunnel for any other anomalies and just come out. So not to manipulate the nerve too much, and also do any of the additional procedures. Vijit will definitely not agree with me. So
I have a question for Professor Bhatt. During the Kametz procedure, which you very well demonstrated, Anil, you mentioned about the pulley. Have you ever used the remnant of the transcarpal ligament as the pulley to route the tendon through a buttonhole in the pulley, and does that help?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the options we want to create, but it's a very flimsy kind of a pulley. A pulley has to be good, strong, and wide enough for the tendon to glide nicely. So if you're trying to use the transcarpal ligament, those fibers, a lot of times you would not be able to do it that way, and it might actually cause a constriction. So better not do that, just leave it free. And you'll, of course, there is some amount of loss of the actual biomechanics in terms of opposition, because there's no pulley. But otherwise, instead of that, if you actually scar it down and cause a kind of a constriction with this kind of a makeshift pulley, then it's not worth it. So if you do it properly, like the way we do it with an FCU flap for other procedures, but otherwise not really necessary.
Yeah, because I find even if you don't have a pulley, this transfer works pretty well,
Yeah.
And doesn't cause any much of functional loss in terms of palmar abduction of the thumb. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, Ravida.
Anil, one question to you. I mean, when we use the endoscopic procedure, I mean, would there be any sort of situations where you would, I mean, I was told by one of my, professors, is when you encounter a hypertrophic palmaris brevis, that is probably a harbinger of anatomical abnormalities to expect them in the course of the, you could get a, transligamentous, nerve innervation, or, some other anomalies in the median nerve itself. So how far is that true? And, are there any things which would sort of make you exclude considering, endoscopic procedure and, consider a primary attempt at open carpal tunnel release?
Well, my approach to that is very simple. I just do an ultrasound preoperatively for all patients. So that gives me a complete anatomical picture as to what's happening inside the tunnel and outside the tunnel. Very simple.
So you did that for all your cases, ultrasound?
Yes, we have a proforma where all these are mentioned. Persistent median artery, any anomalous vessels, any kind of a transligamentous branch of the recurrent branch of the median nerve. All this is already mentioned in the proforma. The ultrasoundologist which has to just say yes or no for me. And so that is a precaution I take in terms of course, people will tell it's a logistical issue, but for us at least it's not so. So in that sense, I play it safe in that way.
Absolutely.
But yes, if that transligamentous or intraligamentous kind of a branching can happen even when you're doing an open procedure, and it's called as $1 million nerve actually, because of the amount of lawsuits in the US about that particular injury. So if at all inadvertently there is an injury to that, people will definitely have a lot of issues in terms of the motor branch itself being cut off. The percentage, people might quote a lot of percentages based on the literature, but for the patient it's 100%. So the surgeon has to be careful when he's dissecting. As I said, that's why teasing out those fibers slowly, then millimeter by millimeter, I think that's the only way to do that.
The most common issue with endoscopic release is incomplete release, initial stages, because if you see that is one of the most common.
Yeah, we have about now 250 plus cases now. Actually, we have published the first 100 case. We published our experience of first 100 case, and I have almost 30 to 40% conversion rate in that. In the initial few cases, we divided into 10 cases each. And then we saw, so my conversion rate at that time was so high because any small, kind of a doubt, I used to abort the procedure. So if I don't see the distal edge, I used to abort. If there's a lot of fluid, I used to abort. So the conversion rate definitely has dropped down so much now. I hardly convert anything to open release now. That comes obviously with the experience. But as you said, yes, incomplete release, it's only if you go on trying to do the release completely, with all the clouded visualization there or fluid there. So best is always to open up and complete the procedure. So any doubt, come out. That is what it is about endoscopic release. You're dealing with a lot of structures there, very, very close by to the blade. So please be careful of that.
I think you never guarantee an endoscopic. It's always open stroke endoscopic.
The consent is always that. The consent is always.
Dr. Anup, there is one question for you. So you are using part of FCR for reconstruction of the ligaments. So why don't you use a palmaris tendon? You can use that tendon. There is a spare tendon there.
Actually, the advantage is it is more radial and it's attached to the second metacarpal. So that is the most common tendon which is being used. And there are few people we have which have used the ECRB also for this from the dorsal side. Actually, there are so many variations for this that ranging from acute repair and for degenerative till, there's so many variations. There are few which uses the hardly 6 centimeter of FCR, pass it through the scaphoid, and then reattach to the dorsal aspect of the distal radius. And the concept they say is that once the scaphoid is fixed, there is no further scapulonate subluxation. There are few which passes through the scaphoid and then fix it through the anchor suture over the lunate on the dorsal aspect to re-augment the scapulonate ligament reconstruction. So their procedure, and there are few which do not do anything and they just do a capsulodisc on the dorsal aspect. So there are n number of procedures which has been demonstrated and had been really proven with time. So there are n number of actually options which are there. This is just one of the procedure which is being shown. So I mean, how Abhijit, you normally do this scapulonate dissociations, no?
Very good question, sir. So this month end, I'll be speaking at the American Society of Surgery of the Hand annual conference, and my topic is precisely this global review of reconstruction procedures for scapulonate. And there are close to about 40 procedures that have been described in literature. And there is nowhere in literature, leave apart a level one, but we don't even have a level 2 kind of evidence about what works best for scapulonate, chronic, kind of injury, reconstructive procedures. But there is a very good classification that has been described by Mark Garcia Elias, where he takes into consideration multiple factors such as the cartilage status, ligament status, whether the scaphoid is reducible or not. And then based on the yes or no answers to those questions, the reconstruction is planned. And he has recently described a techniques where he uses the ECR-L hemitendon, and then he brings it from the dorsal to the volar anterior, so in front of the scaphoid, weaves it through the scaphoid. So, and then he brings it back to the lunate. So let's not talk about the technical aspect, but let's talk about the biomechanics. So chronic or rather scapholunate injury, like you rightly said, causes this so-called DC pattern where the scaphoid flexion is the culprit, or that's the issue. And we have seen a lot of times reconstructive or reparative procedures which aim or are successful in correcting the scaphoid flexion work best rather than the attempt at reducing the diastasis. So if you're bringing the scaphoid from flexion to extension via a tenodesis method or a ligament reparative method, whatever, or there is a growing evidence and recognition of the contribution of extrinsic stabilizers. So we have described a technique where we use the dorsal capsule and the so-called DCSS ligament to correct this scaphoid flexion. So as long as you're correcting the flexion deformity in a reducible scaphoid, I think that works the best. So there are lots of tenodesis techniques or tendon weave techniques, reparative techniques, but more than the getting into the technical jargon or the technical details, it is very important to understand the fundamental biomechanics, and that perhaps is the key to a successful treatment for scapholunate.
Yeah, that's quite right. Actually, that's what one of this has shown about 20 cases where they are using FCR, passing it through the scaphoid and fixing on the dorsal distal aspect of the radius, just to keep that scaphoid in a stable position. So you're right, though, that is the basic biomechanics actually which one need to understand to follow different procedure which one may adopt actually.
True. So the only caveat here is that people now recognize that any procedure which kind of does this, there is a loss, very significant loss of palmar flexion of the wrist joint. So they have now almost given up reattaching the tendon to the radius, but instead weave the tendon through the through the radio lunate or the radiocarpal ligaments, and then stitch it on back to itself so that the flexion can be maximized. Anil, do you have any inputs on this? Would you like to add something to this, please?
I think at the end of the day, it's basically you need to create the anatomy back. So now we talked about people, doing basically trying to lift up the scaphoid and anchoring it back somewhere. It could be, the capsule, the old capsulodesis, or to the radius itself. And then creating something between the scaphoid and the lunate, only dorsally telling that the dorsal part of the ligament is more stronger. So we'll create only the dorsal part of it. But then there is the intraosseous part of it. There is the volar part of it. All are torn when you see a scapholunate diastasis. And the scaphoid is moving independently on its own. So which means to say that you need to have the 360-degree kind of a reconstruction, which should then the original anatomy tries to come back. So which again is I'm sure Abhijit will be speaking and representing India for all of us, but then it is the 360-degree kind of a reconstruction, which is what is being talked about now, the box reconstruction all around. And that would actually create the entire scapholunate ligament, which is torn. And you can add something of a capsulodesis again, so that the scaphoid doesn't flex further. But those are all additional procedures. The core would be still, I think, to recreate the original scapholunate ligament, how it wraps around the scaphoid and the lunate. No way we can do it this way, so we do it this way. That is what is the difference between the original ligament and what we will be constructing now. Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to your take on Abhijit and Anil. There's one study which they've talked about the scaphotrapezium ligament. They say that it is much more important than, in fact, the dorsal SLL. So I couldn't find any further study on this. That was just one study. So since you are working on this for this global scenario about the scapholunate dissociation, could you find anything further on this aspect that this particular ligament, scaphotrapeziotrapezium ligament, is equally or more important than SLL?
Can I take that question? Anil, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So let me try to address that question. It's very. Have you all heard about the story of the elephant and the blind men, the 10 blind men? So each of those blind men is trying to, explain what an elephant is through his understanding or perception of the part that he was looking at, right? I think scapholunate ligament also is pretty much similar to that story. I mean, I think we can draw a lot of philosophy from that story. So people who have been focusing their research and investigations on one particular aspect of the biomechanics, or what they have concluded from their studies as the most important aspect of the stability. For example, we believe that we described this septum along with my mentor, Professor Christophe Mathula, something called as the dorsal capsular ligamentous septum, and we believe that is a very important contributor. P.C. Ho and his colleagues believe in the box technique repair. Then there are people who talk about, for example, Gelberman and El Saidi, they talked about the dorsal intercarpal ligament. There is a group of people who believes that the STT ligament is also important. But I think at the end of the day, it is not only one, but now I think also the studies by Mark Garcia Elias and Elizabeth Agert, they have shown the role of the flexor carpi radialis as a dynamic stabilizer. So we are still evolving in our understanding of the scapholunate ligament and the articulation. There is no one single, or even we don't have a plausible theory of stability as well as reconstruction. And understand that all those techniques that have been described, they get nowhere close to reproducing the kinetics and the kinematics of the scapholunate articulation. It's not just a simple flexion extension in the carpal rows. There is also rotation, and we cannot reconstruct that rotation aspect. So I think we are trying to address a problem that is extremely difficult. The wrist is perhaps the next frontier in orthopedic surgery, especially the scapholunate articulation. And time will tell more with all these wonderful minds who have dedicated themselves to studying this problem, and the beautiful, I think advent of arthroscopy has also helped a lot. Biomechanical and mechanical studies are helping us a lot. So I'm sure that the near future will hold some answers, if not a complete solution for this intriguing problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The unsolved problem. Yeah. I think we don't have any question.
I think the STT concept came only because of the cadaveric dissections actually. Yeah. And they saw that only after the STT resection, only the scapholunate started moving. So even if you take off the complete scapholunate, nothing happens actually.
Nothing happened. Actually, it started from there.
Yeah. So these are all the secondary stabilizers. Now, if you look at any MRI report, no MRI report talks about anything about STT ligament or the dorsal intercarpal ligament, any of those things, because even radiologists are not familiar with the anatomy. Every MRI report has TFCC injury, even if there's no TFCC injuries. Now familiar with TFCC part, but they're not familiar with the rest of the ligaments which happen. So there are a lot of other ligaments which might be injured, which nobody is picking up. So now again, when we see a scapholunate and we see the injury and we see it through the arthroscope, we try to go and repair that, but we are not looking at the other ligaments. So that is where the failure happens. Probably, we don't know. As Abhijit said, we're learning. And each time now from the dorsal repair, now people have gone to dorsal and volar kind of a thing. So that is probably the next step. Now next people will start looking at STT area and the sites on this side and see whether that has to be recommended. At the end of the day, I think we should not cause more harm to that wrist, make it more stiff than what patient would have instead of just without minimal intervention. I think that should be the basic principle of treating this.
Yeah, finally, Mark Avjit. Yeah.
Can I have one very quick, just to add to all this potpourri of what we're talking about. There is now also compelling evidence of neurosensory feedback. That's the reason why in these cases, they now say that you should not do a posterior introitious nerve neurectomy. And people have moved away from what was called as a Berger ligament sparing approach to a nerve sparing approach, capsulotomy of the wrist joint, so as to not damage the sensory nerve innervation to the capsule. So I think, it's a multifactorial thing. There are mechanical contributors, there are introitious and extraosseous ligaments, intrinsic and extrinsic contributions, as well as proprioceptive mechanisms that are very important in, scapholunate stability and kinematics and kinetics. Thank you.
I think we don't have any question. Over to Ravida for vote of thanks. I think it's 2 hours. We should end this session.
I think I would like to thank Ashok and Neeraj. Thank you very much. Without Ortho TV, I don't know, what we would be doing. We are immensely grateful to them for the opportunity. I would like to thank Dr. Anup Agarwal, Secretary of UP Orthopedic Association, for joining us today and giving us his valuable time. I would like to thank my colleagues, Professor Anil Bhatt from Manipal and Dr. Abhijit Vaigaonkar from Pune. I think we had some excellent talks and very good deliberations, and I hope it would have benefited a lot of people and answered a lot of questions about common problems we face in treating these kind of problems. I would like to thank Rajiv. Rajiv, thank you very much for joining us and giving us the opportunity. And with that, I would like to conclude today's webinar. And I hope to meet you all soon, either online or hopefully with the end of the pandemic, maybe early next year, fingers crossed, in person. Till then, let us hope and pray. Take care, stay safe, and good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Waiting to meet you all in Kolkata hand course. Next Kolkata hand course by Ravida. Yeah. Good night. Stay safe. Stay with me.
Thank you. Stay safe. Bye-bye.